Schwartz has reportedly been requested to interview for the Baltimore head coaching job. Well, now, Adam Schefter just tweeting this out. It involves the Browns.
If you thought you'd seen everything the NFL had to offer, think again, because what just leaked has some of the most powerful owners in football scrambling behind closed doors. This is spill news, where secrets don't stay buried, they explode. And this one, it involves John Harbaugh, Shedeur Sanders, and a move so quiet, so calculated, that the entire league is now in damage control mode. The internet couldn't believe it, and trust me, you won't either. One moment, this was just off-season chatter. The next, insiders were whispering about backroom calls, leaked promises, and a power play that crossed lines nobody was supposed to touch. Fans started asking questions. Bloggers started digging. And suddenly, NFL owners weren't just angry, they were panicking. Because nothing rattles billionaires like a deal they didn't approve. If you were in this position, same betrayal, same threat to your control, what would you do? Shut it down or strike back harder? Screenshots started circulating. Bro said too much and they got him, one fan posted. Another wrote, this feels bigger than football. And they're right, because this isn't just about coaching. It's about power, ego, control, and a young quarterback caught right in the middle. Let's break it all down, and trust me, it gets uglier. The story didn't start with a press conference. It didn't start with a tweet. It didn't even start with a leaked document. It started quietly, the way most real power moves do, with phone calls that were never meant to be public and conversations that were supposed to disappear the moment they ended. At first, nobody noticed. A few reporters heard whispers. A couple of insiders exchanged texts.
Who speculates on what he's heard about Harbaugh's prerequisites to even be interested in your job.
Okay.
$20 million a year.
Not a problem.
Not a problem. $10 million.
But nothing that would normally shake a league worth billions. Until one name kept coming up again and again. John Harbaugh. For nearly 2 decades, Harbaugh had been the definition of stability. Calm, controlled, unshakable. The kind of coach owners trusted because he didn't embarrass them, didn't leak, didn't panic. A Super Bowl ring, years of playoff runs, a reputation built on discipline and loyalty. He wasn't supposed to be the guy starting fires behind closed doors. And yet, suddenly, his name was being mentioned in conversations that made executives uncomfortable. Because this time, Harbaugh wasn't asking for permission. Sources began hinting that he wasn't waiting for formal interviews. He wasn't sitting by the phone hoping someone would call. He was the one calling, and not in the usual polite, exploratory way. These weren't courtesy chats. These were long conversations, detailed conversations, conversations where Harbaugh was doing most of the talking and the people on the other end were doing most of the listening. That alone raised eyebrows. Then came the second name, Shedeur Sanders, a quarterback with a spotlight already too bright for someone his age. Confident, polarizing, loved by some, doubted by others, watched by everyone. The kind of player who brings attention whether you want it or not. The kind of name that makes owners nervous because it comes with cameras, commentary, and questions they can't always control. When whispers suggested that Shedeur's future was being discussed in these calls, the tone around the league shifted immediately, because now it wasn't just about hiring a coach. It was about influence. Behind the scenes, people started comparing notes. Executives who normally didn't talk to each other suddenly realized they were hearing the same things. Harbaugh asking very specific questions. Harbaugh laying out expectations before anyone had even mentioned a contract. Harbaugh wanted to know who would have final say. Harbaugh wanted to know how much freedom he'd actually have, not on paper, but in practice. And buried inside those conversations, according to multiple whispers, was one uncomfortable theme: quarterbacks. More specifically, whether a team truly believed in the quarterback situation it was selling him, not in a PR way, not in a press release way, in a real win-now way. That's when the tension started to build. Because teams lie about quarterbacks all the time. They hype them, protect them, spin them. But Harbaugh wasn't buying hype. He was probing, testing, asking questions that made people hesitate before answering, questions that didn't sound like curiosity, but evaluation, almost interrogation. And when Shedeur Sanders' name entered that evaluation, the temperature rose fast. Some insiders claim Harbaugh wasn't asking if Shedeur had talent. That part was obvious. What he was really asking was whether the organization would let him do what needed to be done to win with him, develop him, protect him, build around him without interference. And that question hit a nerve, especially in places where ownership had a reputation for getting involved when things got uncomfortable. Suddenly, this wasn't just a coaching cycle. It was a referendum on control. Front offices started to feel exposed. Because if Harbaugh walked away, it wouldn't just look like they missed out on a coach. It would look like they failed a test that said more about their structure than their roster. And nobody likes being exposed like that, especially not people used to being in charge. Behind closed doors, frustration turned into panic. Owners began comparing scenarios. What if Harbaugh took this somewhere else? What if he succeeded immediately? What if it became obvious that he chose an organization because they stayed out of his way? That kind of success wouldn't just make headlines. It would invite questions, dangerous questions. Why didn't he choose us? And then came the first real leak. Not a full transcript, not a recording, just enough detail to confirm what some had feared. Harbaugh wasn't negotiating like a normal candidate. He was setting conditions. He was making teams explain themselves. He was deciding who was worth his time. And in at least one of those conversations, according to lead chatter, Shedeur Sanders wasn't mentioned as a risk. He was mentioned as an opportunity. That detail alone sent shockwaves, because it reframed everything. If Shedeur wasn't the obstacle, then something else was. Something bigger, something harder to fix. And that something pointed straight at ownership culture, power dynamics, and long-standing dysfunction that no contract clause could magically erase. As fans started connecting dots online, theories exploded. Screenshots of old interviews resurfaced. Clips were rewatched with new context. Every past comment suddenly felt loaded. Every pause felt intentional. And the idea that Harbaugh might be quietly aligning himself with a future quarterback while forcing owners to confront their own flaws became impossible to ignore. At that point, the anger wasn't just about a secret move. It was about what that move implied. Because if Harbaugh could do this once, he could do it again. And if one coach could flip the leverage like this, others might follow. Owners weren't just worried about losing control over one decision. They were worried about losing control of the process itself. That's when the calls started going the other way. Not to Harbaugh, between owners, between executives, between people trying to figure out how much damage had already been done, and whether stopping it now would make things worse than letting it play out. Meanwhile, Shedeur Sanders remained silent. No posts, no reactions, no clarifications, which, in a moment like this, only made things louder, because silence invites interpretation. And interpretation in this league turns into narrative fast. By the end of that week, one thing was clear. This wasn't about one team. It wasn't about one coach. And it definitely wasn't just about one quarterback. It was about power shifting in a league that pretends everything is controlled, scheduled, and predictable. And just when owners thought they had identified the problem, just when they thought they knew what a line had been crossed, another detail surfaced from those private calls that changed the entire conversation and set the stage for what came next. The moment that detail surfaced, the entire tone around the situation changed. Because up until then, owners could pretend this was just aggressive networking, a powerful coach feeling out the market. Nothing illegal, nothing unprecedented. But this new piece of information suggested something far more uncomfortable. It suggested intent. According to multiple insiders who later spoke anonymously to League Connected Media, Harbaugh wasn't just asking teams if they believed in their quarterbacks. He was asking what they were willing to change to prove it, not in vague terms. In specifics, control over staff, control over development timelines, control over who speaks publicly and who stays quiet. These weren't hypotheticals. These were conditions. And in at least one of those conversations, The discussion allegedly shifted to Shedeur Sanders in a way that caught people off guard, not as a gamble, not as a project, but as a leverage point. That's where the scandal really begins. Because once a quarterback becomes leverage, the game stops being about football and starts being about power. One source claimed Harbaugh framed it bluntly. If a team truly believed it could win with a young quarterback like Shedeur, then it would need to demonstrate patience, alignment, and trust, not just from the coaching staff, but from ownership itself. And that was a problem, because some owners are famous for having everything except patience. Almost immediately, blogs and fan accounts picked up on unusual activity. Old interviews were clipped. Anonymous posts began circulating on message boards. Someone claimed they'd heard about a deal before the deal. Another suggested Harbaugh was quietly building a future without telling anyone what it looked like. Screenshots of supposed DMs popped up, allegedly from people connected to front offices, saying things like, "This isn't normal," and "He's making demands before even visiting." Of course, none of it was officially confirmed, but the pattern was there. And in today's NFL, patterns are enough to spark chaos. Then came the reactions. Some fans were furious, not at Harbaugh, but at ownership. Posts flooded timelines accusing certain teams of being scared of losing control. Others defended the owners, saying no coach should ever have that much power. And then there were the Shedeur debates. Endless, loud, emotional. People arguing whether he was worth this level of disruption, whether he was being used, whether his name was being weaponized without his consent. One viral post summed it up perfectly. This feels like chess, and the owners just realized they're playing checkers. As the noise grew, league insiders began quietly pushing back. Stories leaked suggesting Harbaugh was being unrealistic, that he was asking for too much, that he wanted total authority, a phrase designed to scare the public and make ownership look reasonable by comparison. But those same insiders couldn't explain why teams were still on the phone with him, couldn't explain why the calls kept happening, couldn't explain why nobody had walked away yet. Behind the scenes, the fear wasn't that Harbaugh would leave. It was that he would stay somewhere else and prove a point. And then came the leaked talking points. Not documents, not emails, just repeated phrases showing up across different shows, different reporters, different platforms. Words like extensive, preliminary, evaluative, all carefully chosen, all designed to frame Harbaugh as the one in control. Whether intentional or not, the message was clear. This wasn't a coach begging for a job. This was a coach deciding which organizations were functional enough to deserve him. That flipped the narrative overnight, because now every team connected to those calls was under a microscope. Fans started asking why their franchise was even in the conversation. Analysts debated whether being considered was actually a compliment or an indictment. And for teams with long histories of dysfunction, the scrutiny was brutal. Then someone asked a question nobody wanted to answer out loud. What if the quarterback discussion was a smokescreen? What if Harbaugh wasn't testing belief in Shedeur Sanders at all, but testing honesty? What if he already knew which quarterbacks he could work with, and was instead using that question to see who would lie to him, who would oversell, who would dodge? In other words, who would eventually interfere? That theory spread fast. And it didn't help that one analyst jokingly remarked on air that certain owners would say anything to land a big-name coach. A joke, sure, but jokes have a way of revealing truths people are afraid to say directly. As this theory gained traction, the tone around Shedeur shifted again. Less blame, more sympathy. People started framing him as collateral, a young quarterback caught between a powerful coach and an insecure ownership class, a name being dragged into conversations about control and ego that had nothing to do with his arm or his preparation. And then came the second leak. This one was quieter, but more damaging. A source suggested that one team had floated the idea of making verbal assurances that couldn't realistically be enforced. Promises about staying hands-off, about giving space, about letting football people handle football decisions. Anyone who's watched this league long enough knows how those promises usually end. When that rumor hit, the backlash was immediate. Fans laughed, analysts scoffed. Former players chimed in with knowing sarcasm. Yeah, sure, One wrote, "That'll last until week 3. But Harbaugh, according to people familiar with his thinking, wasn't laughing. He was listening. And more importantly, he was remembering. Because coaches don't forget which owners meddle. They don't forget who leaks. They don't forget who panics when things go wrong. And once that reputation sticks, it's almost impossible to shake. At this point, owners started to feel trapped, pushed back too hard, and it looks like you're scared of accountability. Given too easily, and you risk losing control. Stay silent, and the narrative writes itself. Every option made things worse. Meanwhile, Shedeur Sanders continued to say nothing. No interviews, no clarifications, no subtle social media hints, which, again, only fueled speculation. Some fans praised him for staying out of it. Others worried he was being talked about without any ability to shape the story. And as the league argued, debated, and speculated, one uncomfortable truth settled in. This wasn't blowing over. The toothpaste was out of the tube. The idea that a coach could quietly flip the leverage and force owners to reveal their insecurities had already taken hold. And just when it seemed like the worst had already leaked, just when owners thought the narrative couldn't get any more dangerous, a new name entered the conversation from those same private calls, the name that reframed the entire situation and set off the most explosive reactions yet. The moment that name surfaced, everything tightened. Conversations stopped being theoretical. Jokes disappeared. Because this wasn't just another executive or advisor being whispered about. This was someone whose involvement instantly raised the stakes. Someone whose presence suggested that the situation had moved past curiosity and into consequence. According to multiple insiders, the name that entered those calls wasn't a player at all. It was ownership, not just ownership in general, but specific ownership behavior, histories, patterns, reputations. Harbaugh, it seems, wasn't just evaluating football situations anymore. He was evaluating people. And once that became clear, the league reacted the only way it knows how when power dynamics shift. It closed ranks. Suddenly, stories started popping up painting Harbaugh as difficult, as demanding, as unrealistic. Anonymous quotes appeared suggesting he wanted too much money, too much control, too much influence. The same playbook the league has always used when someone threatens a balance. Discredit the messenger, question the motives, redirect the narrative. But the timing gave it away, because none of those stories existed before the leaks. None of that concern existed while the calls were private. The moment it became public that Harbaugh was choosing, not begging, the tone flipped, and people noticed. Fans noticed. Media noticed. Former players noticed. The sarcasm online was brutal. Funny how he's too demanding now that his leverage. One post read. Another said they love him when they thought he needed them. And right in the middle of all of it sat Shedeur Sanders. The pressure on him changed overnight, not from expectations on the field, but from the narrative around him. Suddenly, his name was tied to power struggles, ownership insecurities, and whispered ultimatums. Every past clip of him speaking confidently was reinterpreted as arrogance. Every moment of calm was seen as calculation. It was unfair but predictable. When institutions feel threatened, they look for a face to attach the fear to. Some insiders claim Shedeur became the silent test. If owners could tolerate the attention he brought, maybe they could tolerate losing control elsewhere. If they couldn't, then Harbaugh had his answer. That idea spread quietly, but once it did, it reframed everything. This wasn't about whether Shedeur could play. It was about whether an organization could handle the spotlight without panicking. And history wasn't on their side. Behind closed doors, reactions grew more emotional. One executive reportedly slammed the entire process, calling it a circus. Another questioned why a coach should be allowed to evaluate ownership at all. And that's when the mask slipped. Because the outrage wasn't about fairness. It was about precedent. If Harbaugh could do this, what stopped the next elite coach from doing the same? What stopped players from demanding structural change? What stopped power from flowing the other direction? That fear is what fueled the strike back. Owners began tightening messaging. Friendly insiders were encouraged to speak. Talking points aligned. The narrative shifted toward stability, tradition and doing things the right way. Code words. Always code words. But underneath them was one clear message. This league belongs to ownership, and anyone who forgets that will be reminded. The problem was the reminder came too late, because by then the idea had already spread. Fans started asking why coaches shouldn't have leverage, why players shouldn't demand structure, why young quarterbacks like Shedeur should be blamed for organizational failures they didn't create. And once those questions enter public consciousness, they don't disappear just because a press release says everything is fine. As the days passed, the frenzy began to cool, but the damage remained. Harbaugh, according to people close to him, stopped returning certain calls. Not dramatically, just quietly. Teams that overplayed their hand found themselves waiting. Teams that hesitated found themselves wondering if they'd already failed the test. And teams that leaked suddenly realized trust, once broken, doesn't come back easily. Shedeur, for his part, eventually did what nobody expected. He showed up, calm, focused, unbothered, no statements, no defenses, just work. And that image alone shifted perception again. Because confidence without explanation unnerves people who are used to controlling the narrative. Some analysts began to suggest that, regardless of where Harbaugh ended up, this moment would linger. That coaches would remember it. That players would reference it privately. That ownership would quietly adjust, even if they never admitted it publicly. Power, once challenged, rarely returns to its exact original shape. In the end, there was no dramatic announcement, no explosive reveal, no single moment where everything collapsed. Instead, there was something more unsettling. Silence, conversations that stopped, deals that didn't happen, decisions made quietly without explanation, the kind of ending that leaves more questions than answers. And maybe that's the point, because scandals don't always end with someone exposed. Sometimes they end with everyone pretending nothing happened, while behaving very differently afterward. Sometimes the fallout isn't public. It's structural, invisible, permanent. John Harbaugh walked away with his leverage intact. Owners walked away more cautious than before. And Shedeur Sanders walked away with a clearer understanding of the system he was stepping into. A system that rewards control, punishes disruption, and fears anyone who refuses to play their assigned role. No arrests, no firings, no official wrongdoing. Just a quiet reminder that in a league built on power, the most dangerous thing you can do is make the people at the top feel exposed. And long after calls ended, long after the leaks stopped circulating, one thing remained impossible to erase. The knowledge that for a brief moment, the balance shifted. And once you know that's possible, you can never fully forget it. She didn't disappear in a headline-grabbing way. There were no sirens, no statements, no apologies. She just faded from the conversation. But the secret stayed. Before you scroll away, let this sink in. Nothing about this story was accidental. Not the leaks, not the silence, not the sudden shift in tone once power felt threatened. This wasn't just a football headline that burned hot and disappeared. This was a quiet warning shot. A reminder of how this league really works when the cameras turn off and the doors close. Because the real question was never whether John Harbaugh could win games. And it was never whether Shedeur Sanders has a talent. The real question was whether the system would allow either of them to succeed without interference. And if you've been paying attention, you already know the answer isn't as simple as fans are told. Think about it. If you were in Harbaugh's position, with all that leverage, all that experience, and all those scars from watching organizations implode, would you trust promises made behind closed doors? And if you were in Shedeur's position, walking into a league where power struggles happen above your head, would you still believe talent alone is enough? This story isn't over. Not even close. The names might change. The teams might change. But the pattern doesn't. Power resists exposure. Control hates questions. And anyone who forces the truth into the light becomes a problem. So now it's on you. What do you think really happened in those calls? Was this owner protecting the league or protecting themselves? Was Shedeur being evaluated or used as leverage in a much bigger game? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear every take, even the uncomfortable ones. Hit that subscribe button, because stories like this don't end cleanly. They evolve, and we'll be right here when the next piece leaks.